We're going to Zoom Facebook Live as we always do, so we're testing the sound and season that we had on Lent and the artwork that everybody did, including some of our friends who are now not here anymore. It was a great class looking at the life of Jesus' last days and the arrest and resurrection of Jesus. So thank you for being here. So were some of you in the service here? It's awkward because we're looking at some heavy stuff the next couple of weeks here, so yeah, we got to keep that. Well, testing, I know it's working in here. Is it working online? We good? Welcome everybody at home. Wendy, this is, or Ellen, this is All right, well, welcome everybody at home. If you're watching, no matter where you are or when it is, this is First Presbyterian Church in York, Pennsylvania. We're glad you tuned in. And of course, we're glad people are here in John Calvin Chapel. My name is Byron. We're starting this new unit on peace in the Middle East. And I'm really nervous. I teach Sunday school all the time, and it doesn't bother me much. But with this class, just because I know it could be a little touchy, it could be a little controversial. It's such a horrific situation going on in Gaza that, and I'm no expert, so I'm really nervous. Just wanted to let you know that, so I'm glad I'm among friends. Let's open in a word of prayer. God of grace, we thank you for your goodness. God of resurrection, we thank you for new life. We thank you for this church. We thank you for these folks that are here and through the great technology, people who are online. Be with us, allow your spirit to guide us, to guide our thoughts and our minds and our attitudes so we could glorify you in all we do and represent your church's mission in the world. So we thank you, God, for this class. We ask you to be with us as we dedicate our lives to your kingdom. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, we're going to do a couple things in this class. And I'm just going to ramble a bit to get us going. So this is the dumb one this week. I'm just going to sort of get us started and frame some things and try to inspire us to think about some things. The next couple of weeks, we'll look a little bit at the history of the Middle East, the crisis in Gaza, where that came from historically. I'm sure most people know that it was the 1940s when a group of people decided that the Jews, particularly in Europe, needed a homeland. Many Jews in Europe wanted to be safe in their own home and didn't really necessarily favor going to Israel. There was some anti-Semitism involved in that, even oddly, driven largely through, even back in the Balfour Declaration, which happened in the early 1900s in England, through a particular theology of some Christians, not necessarily Reformed Presbyterians, but some folks that believe that for Jesus to return, Israel has to have a secular nation state in Israel. And so there was some sort of Zionists that were Christians, actually. Conservative Jews didn't want to start Israel. They believed it was in God's hands and thought it was an abomination for the United Nations to get involved. And so real conservative Jews opposed the forming of Israel. But we'll look at some of that, the history of the 1940s, and then, of course, when in 46, 47, 48, there was a new land in Israel, and, of course, they kicked Arabs out of their homes, including an acquaintance of mine, an author that we know a bit, who still tells the story of losing land that had been in his family for centuries, right near where Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount. It's an interesting story, and we'll talk about Elias Chachor as well later, sort of a Martin Luther King Palestinian Christian. That's something a lot of people don't even know, that there's a lot of Christians in Gaza. We think it is a Muslim Jewish debate, but of course the ancient church of Jesus's, we call it the Holy Land, are still there. Ancient denominations, Catholics and Orthodox and Marianite Catholics and evangelicals, and of course mainline denominational folks through missionary efforts have planted churches there centuries ago. So there's Lutheran churches in Bethlehem, there's Lutheran churches in Palestine, there's evangelical churches, there's Presbyterian churches Arab Christian land. So Palestine is not all Muslim. Well, anyway, we'll look at some of the sort of stuff on the ground and what's going on in weeks to come. Another thing we'll look at in weeks to come is the question of the role of the secular nation state of Israel and the Jewish community that is there. Of course, not everybody in Israel is Jews. There's Christians and Muslims living in Israel as well. But largely a Jewish ethnicity group and a Jewish religious group, being Jewish ethnically and politically as a citizen of Israel, and a true religious Jew are also the different nuances, and we'll talk about that a little. But one of the things we have to grapple with is the Jewish conviction, shared by some Christians, that the Old Testament promises of the Promised Land and of the Davidic kingdom of David having land is still in effect, that it's unconditional, and so Jews of the Bible were promised land, so it's their land. Other Christians may say, nah, it was a conditional thing, they had to be faithful, and Jesus came, and that's sort of off the table now. So there's theological debates, and we'll look at some of those in weeks to come. There's a book we might use a little bit. If anybody wants to buy it, we have it kind of on sale through our bookstore, and the church will help kick in if you can't afford it. We're not exactly going to use the whole book the whole time, but we want you to know about it. It's called Chosen, with a question mark, Reading the Bible Amidst the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. It's by a biblical scholar. Our preachers quote sometimes Walter Brueggemann. Brueggemann used to teach at a Presbyterian seminary in Georgia. He's retired now, but he wrote this book about kind of looking at both sides or all sides of this debate about the land and the promises to Israel. So we'll do a little fancy Bible study. The fancy word for that, how you interpret the Bible, is hermeneutics. You've heard that phrase. How you interpret biblical texts. I mean, it's clear God gave Jews land and promises, and Israel and Jerusalem. So how do you read those things and understand their relevance for today, thousands of years later, after the time of Jesus? So anyway, we'll look at that, but not today. So we're going to do some stuff. Here's another thing we'd like to do. If anybody has specific questions, comments that they have burning in your heart and mind that you want to deal with, there's these little papers. Do we still have these little thing called doodle pads? I can't walk away because of the folks at home. Pads. They're in the pews, and there's little pencils in the pews. If anybody wants to fill out anything, write anything down, you can leave them up here. We'll bring them up here somehow, and we'll look at them over the weeks to come, and maybe our teachers, mostly Stephanie and me, but maybe some others, our teachers will sort of look at those. So as you're thinking through this, there's these little doodle pads, and if anybody wants to write any questions down that you're hoping we address in the weeks to come, we don't have to answer everything today. Fair enough? So write a thing in the little doodle pads. Yeah, he's passing around. Good. And there's little pencils. And if it's about my haircut or anything, just like don't write that. Well, you could write that. Well, I said I'm a bit nervous because I know it's controversial, and I know good people disagree about policy things and long-term solutions. You've heard about the two-state solution and that sort of stuff. So I'm just glad that the Adult Ed Committee is allowing us to do this. Beth and I, my wife and I, joined First Presbyterian in the 1980s after having moved here to open our bookstore in Dallastown. And one of the reasons we joined this church is because they had a peacemaking committee. I helped create it, but I ended up starting a peacemaking committee, and Blair Money, the pastor at the time there, wanted the Presbyterian Church to speak into the very broken world, particularly of the nuclear weapons race that was going on. And the Presbyterians and Methodists and Episcopals and Catholics had joined together to start something called the Nuclear Freeze Campaign, which said we just don't need to be making any more nuclear weapons. We can blow up the world 20 times over already, and we make these giant plutonium triggers that shoot off even bigger bombs and we just need to have a policy that says to create peace with the Russians during the Cold War, we have to at least stop this violent threat to blow up everything. And some of you remember those years, and some of you were maybe part of that ministry. We had something in York County, and we allowed, the church allowed the York County Nuclear Freeze Campaign to meet here. So I was involved in peacemaking here, which is one of the reasons I joined this church. And our witness in the broader community brought in tons of people into the building to think about peace. And overtly Christian stuff, even though the Nuclear Freeze campaign was generic. It led to also concerns that the church sponsored with peacemaking things in the Middle East. Back, you remember the Contras were sneaking around killing civilians in Nicaragua, just bloody stuff. My sister-in-law went in a program where Christians called Witness for Peace were going into war zones to pray, and it was a pretty risky thing, but we sent her here from this church. She wasn't a part of our church. She was part of another Presbyterian church. But we prayed for her here, and they went into the war zones. And they pretty much knew if American citizens were there, they wouldn't kill them. At least that's what we hoped. She saw a massacre with dead children and bloody clothes, which they took to the embassy. Some of you remember a prayer meeting service we had for a whole week. We had people praying around the clock. Some of you remember this? Not for one side or the other in the war of El Salvador and in Nicaragua, but that peace would reign, that whatever Congress would vote, that it would be God's will that peace would come, and that good people may disagree about the politics of it, but we all had the principled value of wanting God's will to be done on earth as it is in heaven, and therefore peace to reign in Central America. And I remember a prayer meeting that my sister-in-law and myself and another person from the church had in Bill Goodling's home after he refused to meet us, and he called me. He was our congressman at the time, called me at 7 on a Saturday morning and said, "I've had a change of heart, Byron. Why don't you come down and we'll pray together?" So Bill and I prayed again. As our church had that, we had that thing you sign up and pray around the clock. So our church has a legacy of talking about controversial issues around peacemaking stuff. And so our current reality here has to be talked about, and it's the legacy of our church. In those years in the 80s, some of you have heard this story often, of how our pastor at the time, Blair Money, was on a ministry exchange in Russia, which was in the early 80s was still kind of controversial to go to this evil land. Reagan said it was an evil empire, which it sort of was. But he went there with to build bridges with the Orthodox Church and with pastors there, and they sent some Orthodox people here. I remember we had protesters outside that wouldn't come into the service and were protesting, saying we were hosting communists. I stood out in the rain and argued with them for an hour and a half and missed the service. But Blair was over there in Moscow, and a peasant woman came up to him and gave him a little 3-ruble note. You've heard this story. And said, "Buy a candle to light for peace," so that there's prayers being offered around the clock as this candle is on. And for decades and decades and decades, it was over there, the red candle that we would continue to buy the flame for, that was originally funded by this peasant woman on the streets of Moscow. So our church has had this sort of ministry for a long time. But still I'm nervous. You know the facts on the ground, and we'll talk about them more later, but at this point, 30,000 people or more have died. The numbers are a little unsure. There's so many people in the rubble that they can't count them, so there's thousands more. 80% at least of the population now in Gaza has been displaced. It's about 2 million people from their homes, huge refugee crisis. Refugee experts have called it a trapped people because there's nowhere to go. They're not allowed to go anywhere else. They're literally walled in some places, the big wall. And some of you have been there. I've never been there. But it's a trapped population that's only allowed the Gaza strips over near the Mediterranean, and the West Bank, which is a different part of the Palestinian situation, which Israel is now illegally annexing with big industrial takeovers, is by the Jordan. They call it the West Bank because it's west of the River Jordan in the Bible. And so the West Bank's over here, and the Gaza Strip is smaller, and it's over here. And over the years, it's been the amount of land that they're allowed to live on is smaller, and the amount of times they're allowed to cross over borders and into Israel. I mean, it's part of Israel, but into Jerusalem. Some people work there, but they got to go through all kind of checkpoints and stuff. It's in a remarkably complex situation. When Jimmy Carter said it's akin to apartheid in South Africa, he was making a very astute observation that the rules and the regulations and the repression and the lack of democracy, the lack of freedom for the Palestinians that live there has been just reprehensible for decades and decades. That's just a fact on the ground. I don't think anybody would disagree that the Palestinians have just been mistreated for decades and decades and decades. Of course, some of them increasingly become radicalized and increasingly have become radically Muslim extremists of the sort that attacked 9/11, not the same people, but the same sort of people, jihadists, who want to destroy Israel. And so Israel has been under attack with bombs flying into neighborhoods forever. It hasn't caused as much damage, but it has been a psychic threat to people in some parts of Jerusalem and some parts of Israel who just are always afraid that their enemies are going to get them. So both sides have been struggling a lot, but of course with the recent attack since the horrendous, horrific, evil attack in October, with the terrible, terrible atrocity run by the Hamas extremists, the reaction of the Israeli military has been severe. And so you watch the news, the homes have been destroyed, the hospitals have been destroyed, the schools have been destroyed, the mosques have been destroyed, the churches, Christian churches have been destroyed, the roads have been destroyed. There's just nowhere for people to go, and it just keeps going. And so there's been calls for a ceasefire. The Presbyterian Church, along with every other major denomination, the Methodists, the Lutherans, the Episcopals, and a whole bunch of non-denominational evangelical alliances have all called for a ceasefire. And the Presbyterian Mission Agency in the fall, late fall, winter, November, asked every Presbyterian church to advocate around mobilizing for a ceasefire, which the Biden administration is very vague on at this point, it seems. So we'll discuss some of this stuff, and next week some of the apartheid conditions that developed in the 1940s. But in recent years there's been sort of essentially a blockade against Gaza, and so for 15 years there's been cutting off electricity and cutting off water and so forth, and now with the bombs falling, there's just no clean water. The health system is a disaster. The aid agencies, like Oxfam America and stuff, have all said that they've just never seen anything like it. So it's a mess. Another thing complicating this, and I hope we get to talk about this coming up too, is that many have found that any criticism of Israel is seen by some as anti-Semitic. And so in some colleges, you can't even use certain words now, like intifada, the uprising. You can't even say that. It's banned on colleges because it's considered anti-Semitic. Well, Jews say that that's not the case. The Presbyterian Peacemaking Outfit, which is part of the Presbyterian World Mission Outfit, hosted a webinar not long ago with a Jewish rabbi from Philadelphia who says, you can't conflate any criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. There is anti-Semitism, which is an part of the problem as well. There are people who just hate Jews. I mean, just think of the neo-Nazis in our country. Just think of the Proud Boys and these other kind of groups that on the far extreme alt-right are now hating, the anti-Semitism is a real thing. Just think of the Holocaust and think of the ugliness of Hamas that wants to see Israel destroyed. So there is anti-Semitism, but that's not to say that a criticism of the nation state of Israel and their policies are somehow anti-Jewish necessarily. Does that make sense? This Jewish rabbi woman said, the state of Israel is a state. It's not a Jew. She goes, I'm a Jew. To hate a Jew is one thing. To criticize this secular nation state of Israel and its policies is not necessarily anti-Semitic. It may be driven by anti-Semitism, but it's largely not. So you have Jews for peace now, and you have Jews and you have citizens in Israel who think that the bombing has just become so grotesque and the deaths have been so extreme that somebody's got to say no. And so there's whole movements of rabbis now criticizing, and as I said, the Presbyterian Peacemaking did a webinar with this Jewish rabbi from Philadelphia, but the Rabbis for Peace, and they just insist that it is not anti-Semitic to necessarily. And of course, if you want to think that it's anti-Semitic or bad or off the table to criticize Israel, then you'd have to discard about half the Old Testament because the Old Testament Hebrew prophets found themselves criticizing the nation and the kings of Israel that were appointed by God. So Jeremiah and Isaiah and Hosea and Joel, the early prophets, the latter ones after exile, all these prophets were often criticizing Israel. So it's not off the table to criticize Israel. That's just biblically unfounded and ethically odd to say that there's a nation that can't be held accountable for what it does. And so even Jewish rabbis are saying that. And now again, there is gross anti-Semitic Jewish hatred, but that's not the same thing as anybody who would, like our Presbyterian church, that has said we have to have a ceasefire in Israel, has to be held accountable. So this horror of all this mass killings is just hard, but we can't justify stuff. So today what I want to do is I'd like to just sort of, in light of this hard news, just offer some biblical themes and some biblical texts and some thoughts of mine about why we should care about anything like this. So this, from here on out, is going to be just real generic to just get us in the right sort of framework for things, and then we'll dive into the deeper stuff in weeks to come, okay? What I want to do is I want to give you 2 quotes that influenced me in my life, 2 hymn texts, 2 lines from one of our book of confessions. We Presbyterians have this book of confession, and I always have to quote that. And then we'll look at some Bible verses, okay? 2 quotes. Here's the first 2. When I was doing the peacemaking stuff that the Presbyterian Church took me in the 80s and allowed my wife and I to actually be a part of this church, we were doing some scary stuff. Praying with Bill Goodling in his home was exciting, but, facing down at protest police that have guns in your face and stuff, and arrests and all those kind of things were sometimes a little hairy, and my mom would sometimes worry, and I would say, well, you're the one that got me here. You taught me to believe the Bible growing up, so I finally convinced her that this was okay. But one of the early quotes, when I would ask myself, how did I get myself here? How did I become sort of a public activist in those years? I remember this quote that I learned somewhere along the line, allegedly from Martin Luther, the 1500s, the early Reformation. He never met John Calvin, the founder of the Presbyterians, but almost. He was just a little bit before Calvin. And Luther said something like this. It's unclear if this is a paraphrase or if he actually said it. There's a lot of Luther quotes that Luther never really said. But he said something like this. He said, if you preach the gospel, as well you should, but you fail to relate it to the burning issues of the day, you haven't preached the gospel at all. Isn't that interesting? That if you preach the gospel, as you should, but you don't relate it to the burning issues of the day, that isn't even the gospel at all. Why would he say such a thing? I think one of the reasons behind that is what you might want to call the theology of the incarnation. That Jesus became a human being on the planet to start his reign, to teach his ways. God did not say distant and abstract as if God is an idea that floats in heaven, but got involved in the muck and messiness of human history. That's sort of the core, one of the core 2 or 3 things of the Christian belief. We believe in a triune God who, out of love, made a world good. And when it got messed up, he invaded it himself. He sent his Bible, he sent his prophets. That never worked. So he said, all right, I'm coming down myself. And Jesus shows up with flesh, born of the Virgin Mary, to establish and inaugurate a new regime, a regime change from the kingdom of God. And so the incarnation shows us that Christianity is always on the ground, feet on the ground, real world. The church is in the world, but not of it. And so the Christian faith, if it is not relevant to the issues of the day, then it's just nothing. It's just abstract God talk. And that's not Christianity. Christianity is, for God so loved the world. The Greek word there, you've heard me say before, is the cosmos, the stuff of earth. It doesn't say, for God so loved your souls. It doesn't say, for God so loved your churches. It said, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. And so through Jesus, and then in the power of the Holy Spirit, he invades the world to show his love for the real world, the brokenness as it is. He loved us so much that he came. And so that's why Luther would say that if you want to talk about the gospel, you got to talk about the real gospel. And the real gospel is incarnational. It's in the world. Okay? Another quote that I was deeply touched by as I read it as a high school kid. I was studying Martin Luther King and so forth. And he said, it's unclear where he said this, but it was in one of his sermons. He was a preacher. And it was in one of his sermons, maybe 65, they think, probably at a church in Selma. And he said, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter most. Isn't that a good quote? We begin to die a little bit when we become silent about the things that matter most. Now, the question about what matters most and which side you are on political and social issues, good people can disagree. Again, this doesn't necessarily solve the problem, but it gives us a frame to at least thinking that God's people must be involved because God loved the world, and we begin to die a little bit as people when we don't get involved in stuff, because this is what we're here to do, to rule God's world, to make God's world, to be agents of God's regime in the world. It's what we do. It's what it means to be alive. And so we die a little bit when we just become apathetic, when we don't care, when we become complicit with silence. 2 quotes. How about 2 hymns? Let's look at 2 hymns. Here's one of my favorites. I blame my mom for this. This is my Father's world, right? You know the song. This is my Father's world. It's a praise about nature and the goodness and hearing God in the rustling grass. And he shines in all that's fair. You know, God likes good stuff in the world. He loves his world. But then there's this line, written in 1901, by the way. This is my Father's world. Oh, let me ne'er forget that, oh, the wrong seems oft so strong. God is the ruler yet. Kids today don't even know hymns like this anymore. But some of us grew up knowing that despite the wrong in the world, God rules. And that's just sort of a frame we want to bring to any conversations of controversial issues. That this is our Father's world, and we can't forget that even though the wrong seems off so strong, God is the ruler yet. Here's another hymn. God of grace and God of glory. There's some old timers in here. You know this one. And if you don't, this is what we have in our hymn book. It's actually page 307. I didn't look at this version of it, so I hope what I'm going to read matches my memory. But this is what I think it says. God of grace and God of glory. By the way, this was written in 1930. A Presbyterian minister, John Fosdick. I think he was Presbyterian. Was he at Riverside, New York? Fosdick. God of grace and God of glory, on thy people pour thy power. Crown thine ancient church's story, bring its bud to glorious flower. So there's a story already. And the church has this story, God's redemptive story, and we need to bring it to flower here in the world. Grant us wisdom, grant us courage for the facing of this hour, That resonates with me. We need wisdom. There's no easy answers to stuff, especially like the conflict in the Middle East. There's no one-size-fits-all answer, and everything's been tried and it still ain't working. But we are people of hope that believe in last Sunday's event of resurrection, that God, in God's mercy, is still going to bring his story to flower. So what we need is courage and wisdom, I think. Not just a lot of facts and data or Bible verses. We need courage and we need wisdom. Well, anyway, he goes on and says, lo, the hosts of evil round us scorn thy Christ and assail his ways. From the fears that long have bound us, free our hearts to faith and praise. Grant us wisdom, grant us courage for the living of these days. Cure thy children's warring madness. Bend our pride to thy control. Shame our wanton selfish gladness, rich in things, but poor in soul. Grant us wisdom, grant us courage, lest we miss thy kingdom's goal. Isn't that powerful stuff? 1930. He was worried about materialism and our souls dying because we're rich in things, but we don't even know God, and that the world is out to assail the ways of Jesus. Cure thy children's warring madness. Save us from weak resignation to the evils we deplore. Let the gift of thy salvation be our glory evermore. Grant us wisdom, grant us courage, serving thee whom we adore. Well, I don't know when I first heard that. I probably heard it as a teenager in the 60s, and I probably thought it was boring as all heck. And then one day it just clicked. It was life-changing for me, this verse, that third verse. Well, anyway, we Presbyterians have this constitution, part of it we call the Book of Confessions, and there's all these confessions that elders have to swear by. So you guys know this probably better than I do because I'm not an elder. But the Confession of 67, we've taught it in this Sunday school class already, is built around the theology of reconciliation. Maybe if you were here in Sunday school or watched it online last week, we read a passage or two about reconciliation, that the gospel accomplishes great reconciliation. And this is this confession written in 1967 when the church was still divided over the North and the South from the Civil War days and stuff. And as the church was moving towards reconciliation and unity, they wrote this confession, and it's part of our book of confession. Here's just one paragraph from it. It's about the resurrection of Jesus. It says, the life, death, resurrection, and promised coming of Jesus has set the pattern for the church's mission. His life as a man involves the church in the common life of men. Now it uses masculine language here, people. His service to men commits the church to work in every form of human well-being. So his service teaches us to serve others. His suffering makes the church sensitive to all the sufferings of humankind, so that it can see the face of Christ in the faces of people in every kind of need. So Jesus' service sets the agenda or the framework of our ministry in the world. We serve others. His own suffering sets the agenda for our faith, our life in the world, because we now become caring about people who suffer, and we see the face of Christ in those who suffer. His crucifixion discloses to the church God's judgment on man's inhumanity to man and the awful consequences of its own complicity and injustice. In the power of the risen Christ and the hope of his coming, the church sees the promise of God's renewal of human life and society and of God's victory over all wrong. I mean, do we believe this?
Could you give us the address on that in the book?
932.
932, thanks.
He's a Presbyterian minister. Anybody that wants to know the number of it, yeah, all the paragraphs are numbered so you can talk about them easy. It's 932. The life, death, resurrection, and promised coming of Jesus sets the framework, the agenda, the tone of our engagement in the world. And that includes service. It includes suffering. It includes an awareness of judgment, a fear about complicity with evil, and a hope that the church sees the promise of God's renewal of humans' life and society and God's victory over all wrong. God isn't just going to blow up the planet and take us to heaven. He made promises to us. And Jesus said he's going to make all things new. And so we in the church have this hope that society will someday have everyone under their vine and fig tree living in shalom. That swords will be beat into plowshares, that lambs will lay down with lions. We believe that. Do you believe that? And that we're now supposed to be the vanguard of making that happen. We're the people in the beginning of the regime change. We're the vanguard praying, thy kingdom come on earth as it already is in heaven, as it will someday be. So, 932 says this right here. It goes on and says, the church disperses to serve God wherever its members are, at work or at play, in private or in the life of society. The daily action in the world is the church's mission to the world. So again, our daily life, our life as citizens, is part of how we worship God. Our thought about whether we want to write to our congresspeople and press for a ceasefire or not is part of our decisions we make as we discern what God's call is for our own lives. The church is dispersed. Each and every one of us is God's hands and feet in the world. Well, here's another quote from the book of Confessions from the 67 Declaration. This is 9.53, Jack. It's the very end of the book of the 67 Confession. And some of us have studied this in the Sunday school class as well. This is 9.53. God's redeeming work in Jesus Christ embraces the whole of man's life. Social and cultural, economic and political, scientific and technological, individual and corporate. It includes humans' natural environment as exploited and despoiled by sin. It is the will of God and his purpose for human life. It shall be fulfilled under the rule of Christ, and all evil shall be banished from his creation. Biblical visions and images of this rule of Christ, such as a heavenly city, a father's house, a new heaven, a new earth, a marriage feast, an unending day, they all culminate in the biblical image of the kingdom. The kingdom represents the triumph of God over all that resists his will and disrupts his creation. Already God's reign is present in the ferment in the world, stirring hope in people and preparing the world to receive its ultimate judgment and its ultimate redemption. With an urgency born of this hope, the church applies itself to present tasks and strives for a better world. It does not identify, by the way, limited progress with the kingdom of God on earth, nor does it despair. In steadfast hope, the church looks beyond all partial achievements to the final real triumph of God. That just inspired me when I became a Presbyterian to realize that this is what our church stakes its life on. This belief that God is at work in the world and the kingdom is coming, and that we're called, therefore, to strive to make the world a better place, to put it in simple language. But that when we see human progress and good things happen, that's not the kingdom yet, really. It's a sort of a signpost of the kingdom. It's an inbreaking of what God might want for his world, but we really ultimately relate and long for and wait for the final coming when Jesus finally makes it all new. So we do our best and hope for the ultimate. Does that make sense? So that's some of the framework that has inspired me, these quotes by Luther and Martin Luther King, these hymns, these confessions. There's tons of Bible verses that talk about this kind of generic stuff. I mean, one would think, given the horrendous situation right now in Gaza, with so many children dead and so much bombing going on, to violating the theories of just wars and the ethics of war fighting, you're not supposed to bomb civilians and all that stuff. I mean, there's just so much horrific stuff going on. You'd think something like the Good Samaritan or Matthew 25 would just seal the deal. I mean, it's like, we know we're supposed to love our neighbors as ourselves. And who is our neighbor? The Washington lawyer asked, who is our neighbor? And Jesus says, well, I'll tell you who it is. And it's this guy on the road. That you think the Good Samaritan, that we all know, or Matthew 25 that most of us know, would just be enough. But to, again, frame it in a broader, just more generic way, let me just share a couple more Bible verses. One of my favorite verses is 1 Chronicles 12:32. And this text is in the middle of a passage in Chronicles. Who reads Chronicles? It became one of my favorite verses when I heard this verse, where they're listing the people that are going to make David the king. And they're listing the different tribes and the different people and these different characters and what they were good at, like what they were going to bring to the table of this. It was kind of like a coup, actually, is what it was. They were going to have this little revolution to make David the king. And they're naming the people, and I don't know, some were strong and some prayed a lot or something, and some, I don't know, had something else. And then it mentions the sons of Issachar. And what they brought to the table, what they were good at, what they were known for is this. They understood the times and they knew what God's people should do. Isn't that a great legacy to have said about you? Isn't that what we need to be, sons and daughters of Issachar? People who understand the world, watching the news and all that stuff. We have sociologists, historians helping us figure out where we are in our moment, in our cultural moment. But also then knowing what a godly perspective will be, what the Bible requires of us, what Jesus wants us to do in that setting. So to understand the times and know what a godly response is. They were the sons and daughters of Issachar. And I thought, oh, that's it. That's kind of a life verse, that we need to find people who can be raised up, a generation who understand the times and know what God's people should do. I mean, that's what we're trying to do in Christian Ed here, okay? Psalm 19, 119, you know this in well. Psalm 119 is one of the longest psalms, I guess. In verse 105, it says, thy word is a lamp for my feet and a light before my path. And I just wanted to say that. It doesn't sound very political about the Middle East. But again, as we move forward into this controversial question of policy and war and in the context of what's going on in the Middle East, we have to say the scriptures are the light before our path. They're the things that give us the illumination. They're the things that the scriptures are the things that open up the insight of what things really are and the way they really are. They're like a light before a path. It shows us the way to go. So I don't care whether you're right, left, or center, or anarchist, or Republican, or whatever. We got to be biblical people. It's the Bible that shines a light before our path, right? And we can work that out, and good people disagree about what things may mean. But I think we need to agree that the scriptures, the authority that guide and shape our path and our journey. It's like a light coming on. You need a little light when you're in the dark. You ever wake up in the middle of the night and you have to go to the bathroom or something, you're trying to find your light and you're just stumbling over stuff. Maybe you guys don't stumble over stuff, but I'm old enough and I stumble over stuff. I just need a little light. And then once the light comes on, it's like, oh, the chair's there. And you begin to kind of understand reality as it really is. And that's what the scriptures do for us. They open up an insight about where we are and what we're to do and the way to go. There's a verse we don't know as well. 2 Corinthians 10, verse 5, if you're taking notes. 2 Corinthians 10, verse 5. And it says to take every thought captive and put it to work for Christ. The Greek word there is interesting. I don't know Greek, but I look stuff up in books sometimes. And I've heard sermons on this, take every thought captive, as if it's about like, I don't know, anger or lust or something. You're walking down the street or you want something you shouldn't want or you're jealous of somebody, like an attitude. That's not really what the verse means. It's actually the Greek word, thought, is the theory. It's a word like Plato used. It's used twice in the New Testament. So it means your philosophical ideas about stuff, your intellectual concepts of what you believe about things. So take every theory that you have about the Middle East captive to Jesus, because the Bible's the light before our path, and we have to see things as God would want us to see them and take our minds and our attitudes. In other words, this is a fancy way of saying it. There's no sort of dualism between the sacred and the secular, between Sunday and Monday, between what you think when you go to church and what you think when you watch the news. Our news theories that we get about current events have to be shaped by the scriptures, because we're to take every thought captive. Now again, how we do that and what that looks like, it's going to be a long, complicated class, and we'll have questions and dialogue and so forth. But we all should agree that the goal is to develop a Christian mindset, a sort of sense of biblically informed lenses, so that we think Christianly about the ideas at hand. That's, again, the task of Christian education for all of us every day in any topic, to develop the mind of Christ and have the renewed mind. It helps us think well about living in the world. Fair enough? You can get inspired by that on Sunday when you hear sermons. That's part of it. You get inspired as you study the scriptures yourself daily, I would hope. As you read Christian books and stuff, we form our attitudes. But the Bible in 2 Corinthians 10 says, take every theory you have about stuff captive for Christ. Philippians 2 verse 5 says to have the mind of Christ, or some translations say have the mindset of Christ. So can we enter this conversation with the mindset of Jesus himself, who walked those very Gazan streets? You know verses like we're called to be salt of the world. You've heard that, right? In Matthew on the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, you are the salt of the world. And if the salt loses its saltiness, then it isn't any good, and you're going to be judged. You're going to be thrown out, it says. Whew. What does that mean? Salt loses its saltiness. What did salt do back in the first century? You've heard this, right? Yeah, it was a preservative. It kept evil and decay at bay. They didn't have refrigerators and stuff, so you put salt around stuff, and it can't. And also, by the way, I like the positive, it spices up the taste a little bit. You know, it brings something good to the taste. So it both fights evil and adds good. That's what salt did in those days. So when Jesus says, you're the salt of the world, at the very least, our presence in the meat, in the sauce, in the world, should help push back the darkness, should help fight the decay, should help resist the violence. Our presence in the world is to be salt. And on a good day, make it a little more spicy, make it a little more fun, make it a little more interesting. And so we have a positive, gospel-centered goodness that we bring to the world, but fundamentally we're there at least to say no to the evil. And to the extent that the church does that, we're salty, out of the salt shaker and into the world. But if we're not salty, Jesus said, get out of here. It's a scary text. Jesus retold it another way, saying it was for people that cook, leaven or yeast in the bread. You just put a little bit in, boom, it rises, right? That was one of Jesus' shortest parables. The kingdom of God is like leaven, like yeast in a loaf. You just put it in the bread and bam, stuff begins to happen. So we're called into the world. I guess that's the obvious thing I'm trying to drill home here today. We're to have a Christian perspective. We're to have a biblically informed perspective. We're supposed to be relevant to the world, sons and daughters of Issachar. And just a little of that goes a long way. As salt, as leaven, as yeast. Light of the world, as another one Jesus put it. Yeah, there's that great little parable. Some of us that study scriptures together on Zoom on Wednesday night, we're studying Matthew. And one of the little quick parables was the mustard seed. And you've heard this 100 times, right? Mustard seed it's tiny. It's a little seed. But Jesus says it's like a mustard seed. Faith is like a mustard seed. And then he goes on and tells the story that it's planted and a whole tree develops, a whole ecosystem develops where even the birds of the air can have safety in its branches. I mean, that's beautiful when you think about it, right? That the little bit of faith that we have develops some sort of ecosystem where there's shalom, where things can be the way they're meant to be, where swords are beat into plowshares. That's the goal, this flourishing of a tree that's healthy and good, and where there's shalom and even the animals find peace there. That's the kingdom of God. But it starts with just a tiny little seed, just a couple of us doing little stuff. in 1 John 3, verse 8, I'm just listing these verses to get us rolling for the upcoming weeks. In 1 John 3, verse 8, John, who was one of Jesus' best friends, in the Gospel of John, he often says that he's his best friend. It's kind of funny. The one that Jesus liked the most. He said, Jesus came, he ought to know, is my point. He said, Jesus came to destroy the works of the devil. Jesus did not come to destroy the world. He didn't come to destroy the works of God. God made the world and said it was good. Jesus didn't come to eradicate that. He came to eradicate the guy that's trying to eradicate the world. Jesus came to destroy the works of the devil. What are the works of the devil? Bombing children? The thing that happened on October 7th? That is so evil. What Hamas did is so evil that it can only be described as the work of the devil. Butchering little children. And the rubble we see now, where they can't even count the bodies, one of the worst disasters so far of the 21st century, is going on in God's name. If that's not evil, then nothing is. So Jesus came to defeat the works of the devil. That's an important verse, I think, and there's a lot packed in there. From the October 6th atrocities to the military, I'm going to call it domicide, the destruction of home. They're not just fighting a war, and they're not just fighting a people group. They're destroying the homes and the infrastructure and the land of where people have lived. It's domicide. Well, anyway. Isaiah 58 is a passage that has meant a lot to some of us, and we've looked at it in this class before, but in Isaiah 58, it's this great passage where the prophet is asking people, answering sort of the questions, I guess, he had from the people, of why God doesn't answer people's prayers. That's sort of the upshot of the text. What's going on? And Isaiah replies and said, you want your prayers answered? Here's what you do. This is the fast that I choose. Let homeless people come in and live in your life, live in your house. Break the bonds of injustices. Stop the economic exploitation of the workers. It goes on real specific about all this justice stuff. It said, then God will hear your prayers. That true prayer, somehow, true spirituality is connected to our solidarity with the hurting and the poor and the oppressed. Read it for yourself. I'm not making this up. But then at the end of Isaiah 58, or near the end of that paragraph, I think it's verse 12, it says, you will become known as the repairer of the breaches. What's a breach? But not breaches. Walls. You're going to become breach menders. You're going to become the people that repair the walls, that fix up and rebuild the ruins of the previous generations. You will become known as people who rebuild the walls, the devastated ruins of the previous generations. If that isn't a verse that we should claim for now in the Middle East and in our broken infrastructure in the United States for that matter, that somehow the church of God's people, God's covenant people, are going to be caring so much as sons and daughters of Issachar. They'll know what to do and know how to do it, and they'll be known as people that are fixing the problems, that are repairing the infrastructure, literally maybe. Breach menders, literally fixing walls, Habitat for Humanity. But more so, I think it's a sort of a metaphor that we're people that are supposed to have insight and wisdom and courage to know how to straighten out the world's problems, and we should be the kind of people that have a reputation and that are called. Now, this is during the time right before exile. The Jews are in exile in Babylon. They're going to get to go home. Jerusalem's already been destroyed. And so Isaiah is saying, when you go back, you're going to become known as the people that know how to solve this thing. And Ezra and Nehemiah and those guys actually fulfilled it. They rebuilt Jerusalem. And so again, we need people that have a vision of being so relevant to the world, so much salt and light in the world, so much yeast in the loaf, that people go, wow, you're the people with a reputation for rebuilding the devastations of the previous generations. Well, that's just my little sermon about the kind of stuff we need to be doing. Here's what I'd like to do. I have about 10 verses on peacemaking, and I'm going to skip them because we're out of time. But you know the texts about the dangers of military solutions that were prevalent in the Old Testament. I hope you do. You know, the swords into plowshare stuff, that we read it at Christmas every year, that the bloody boots from the warriors are going to get burned. God's going to have nothing to do with that anymore. In Isaiah 11, it says, they will not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain. In Zechariah 4, verse 6, it's a political text about the nations, and it says, not by power and not by might, but my spirit, saith the Lord. It sounds like a charismatic renewal verse, but it's an international affairs verse, actually. As is, by the way, be still and know that I am God. It's about the weapons of the big corporation, of the big leaders of the nations. And then the King James says, cease striving. In other words, it says, quit making weapons, is what that verse means. Be still and know that I'm God. Contemplatives use it all the time. It's an anti-war verse, I'm sure of it. You know, David and Goliath. What's the point of David and Goliath? At the end of the David and Goliath story, it says, so that you will know that we serve a God who does not save with sword and spear. You know those texts where they would go out to fight and they would lose. And then God says, cut your men in half. Who is that guy, little man? Cut your men in half. Oh, that's too many. Cut them in half. Oh, just take out a few. Oh, I'll never win now, God. Yeah, now you got to trust me. And you're not trusting on war horses and chariots and the strength of your armies, and then a handful of guys go out and win the battle. Over and over in the Old Testament, military might is seen increasingly as dangerous. A war horse is a false sign of salvation, so Psalm 33. Psalm 31 says, woe to those who go down to Egypt to form military alliances. Over and over, the military might is considered an idol. Horses are always named as bad because they were war horses. Chariots, the ICBM of its day, invented by the Assyrians. God forbid them from use them. Oh, we need them, God, to keep up with our enemy. Nope, you don't use them. In fact, it says it's the beginning of sin of you in the book of Micah. It was the storehouse where they carried the chariots when they were using them. So Israel gets into trouble when they increasingly depend on military might. And the U.S. is given $3.8 billion every single year of military aid to Israel, year after year after year. And then in October, Biden requested $14.3 more billion. As the death count was of children mostly, and old ladies and stuff, and sick people were mounting and mounting and mounting in the winter, December, Biden declared an emergency because the Israeli tanks were running low on weapons. As I read these biblical texts, it just doesn't jive. It just doesn't make sense that we increasingly take the military solution. Geez, we're almost out of time. I got to say this. Here are three key things we're going to kind of camp out on as we move forward. One is that Israel has, it's just a matter of fact, been terribly unjust since the 1940s. And it is at least understandable to know why so many Palestinians want freedom and dignity. It is very much akin to the South African apartheid situation. There's parallels between the United States and how we treated our indigenous people, that we finally are kind of coming to realize how wrong it was to create genocide here and wipe out Indians and stuff. And so there's sort of this natural understanding we should have for why Palestinians are just really upset that land has been stolen and that they were repressed and have to go through all kind of rigmarole, you know, the details of the way in which the occupation has just taken away the dignity of so many. So that's just sort of something we need to unpack. Nonetheless, another thing we have to unpack is that Israel has been under attack by people that hate them. They have been surrounded by enemies, and they have a strong military, and they have survived. And they continue then with October 7th to underscore the constant threat that they are under. And so here's sort of what I think our proposal will be. We need to be pro-Israel, pro-Palestinian, and pro-peace. It's the only way. We can't be taking sides. I think a biblical worldview would lead us to think that a shalom can only break out in conflict resolution when the sides are brought together. And so we have to understand with empathy the injustices that the Palestinian people have gone through for decades and decades and decades. People that were made refugees in the 1940s and families that were born there and their children were raised there, and they still don't have their homes. They lived their whole lives in refugee camps. And we have to understand the humongous threat that Israel is under, with enemies from Jordan and Syria, and I mean the whole Middle East is Iran, and so the geopolitics of all that. So we have to be sensitive to both those, which makes me want to be pro. Yeah. Here's what I would recommend. There's an organization called the Telos Foundation, T-E-L-O-S. If you're savvy with the internet, look them up. A buddy of mine, a guy I know, is one of their founders. He was a an aide in Congress for a senator, a Republican, conservative Republican friend of mine, evangelical. And another Christian guy, Greg Khalil, who is Palestinian Christian. And Greg was a liberal Democrat and on the side of the Palestinians and working to help, in the White House, helping Palestine and Israel learn to talk to each other. Well, these two guys met each other, and they were completely different politically and socially, and they became best friends, Todd Detheridge and Greg. And they formed this organization, Telos, to say we both agree with the same end, peace in the Middle East. And so we have to be both pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli, and that's where the pro comes from the Telos. If you go to their website, they're now taking their model and they're applying it to other places, Northern Ireland and South Africa, and even some urban situations in the United States, to find sort of civil ways for people to talk about complicated stuff together on tables and meetings. They take people to the Middle East, but they don't go to the fancy Holy Land tours. They meet guys like this Elias Kakor, Palestinian pastor whose land was stolen and has been an agent for change ever since.